let's make a start. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Society of St. Sophia. Welcome to this event from the Ukrainian Institute in London. My name is Ursula Woolley. I'm the Chair of Trustees of the Ukrainian Institute in London. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. It's a great pleasure as well and an honour to be moderating this talk by Tetyana Filevska, who is the creative director of the Ukrainian Institute, the State Ukrainian Institute in Kiev, and who has been organising the most extraordinary programme globally and in the UK since the State Ukrainian Institute was set up in 2018. And before that, she worked at the ADOS Foundation Centre for Contemporary Art, among many other things, at Izolyatsiya, the platform for cultural initiatives, which many of you will also have heard of, and was involved in the first Kiev Contemporary Art Biennale, Arsenale, in 2012. That seems an incredibly long time ago now, and is the author of books, among other things, about Malevich's time in Kiev, 1928 to 30, and about the Ukrainian art historian Dmytro Gorbachev, who I think is still alive, still with us. Is that right? Yes. And this evening, Tetyana is going to talk to us. We're going to have a visual treat of thinking about Ukrainian modernism first, and I guess we're also going to have the pleasure of thinking about cultural politics in the broadest sense, in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine this year. So lots of beautiful things to think about and lots of interesting things to think about. And Tetyana's going to give us a short talk, and then there will be plenty of time for discussions and question and answer. And if I'm right, Maria, we're not going to record the Q&A. Is that right? So, super. So, Tetyana, welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
And floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And we always joke that this moment will sometimes happen, that the two Ukrainian Institutes will do something together, and this is it. The Ukrainian Institute Kiev that I work with and the Ukrainian Institute in London, despite we're being separate institutions, but we are doing the same kind of job, and it's very nice that we can cooperate and in a very direct way, just having a joint event. And thank you all for coming and taking your time to talk about Ukrainian art. I wasn't aware about, how much you know about Ukrainian avant-garde, so I will do a short introduction about what we're actually speaking about when we are talking avant-garde in Ukraine, what the main things are, so what's the frame, and then we'll turn into a discussion and your questions and answers. So I really hope you will be also active. Actually, Dmytro Gorbachev just celebrated his 85th birthday, so he's well, healthy, and working actively. So, yeah, and I think it was him that that inspired me to work with avant-garde, because my background was in philosophy and I was working more with contemporary art at the moment when I found out that Kazimir Malevich was born in Kiev, and I didn't know anything about it until my 20s, and being graduate of the National University, and I thought this is something that has to be changed, and this is how I started being an expert on Malevich and avant-garde and started working with archives. But yeah, let's do a small introduction, a historical, let's say, introduction about what is the avant-garde in Ukraine in names, dates, places, and topics or genres. And how much actually we know about avant-garde in Ukraine? Like, what are like the 10 things, top 10 things you can think about when you think about avant-garde in Ukraine? Like at least 5 things or 3, or at least like one name you should know about avant-garde. I would start with, Maria, can you? I would start with like the few most important events and names that shaped this movement in Ukraine. I think the first kind of organized event that we had was in 1908, and it was an exhibition in Kiev named Zvino, or Lanka in Ukrainian, if you translate. It was in Chrещатик on the main street of Kiev. Well, back then it wasn't the main street, but now it is. And it was organized by Oleksandra Exter and Davyd Burliuk, both spending most of their times in what is now Ukraine. Burliuk is from the south of Ukraine, in now nearby what is now Kherson area, and Oleksandra Exter spent most of her time in Kiev and was really famous in the city for her huge head, and it was like a part of the folklore in Kiev that Oleksandra Exter can cover the whole city with her head, which had huge size. So that was the first exhibition, which was held actually in the store of musical instruments, and it was quite strange in the city where only kind of classical art and landscape was exhibited before. So when you look at the magazines of the time, you can see a lot of caricatures like that, because people really were surprised by what they saw. So that was not really received, I wouldn't say well, but it wasn't received as deserved, let's say. But anyway, that was the first exhibition of what we call now avant-garde art in Kyiv. And then there was a series of exhibitions that were organized by a sculptor, an artist, Vladimir Izdebsky, who created an international exhibition that toured around different places and cities, what is now Ukraine and Baltic countries and Russia, so everywhere around Russian Empire. And it was a huge event. Picasso was exhibited there, so it was quite early for European modernism to be shown in this part of the world before it was collected and exhibited on permanent display. And then there was another exhibition, which was very local, I would say. If the first ones were more, presenting artists from all over Russian Empire or Europe, this was an exhibition that gathered artists from Kiev and Ukraine, what is now Ukraine. So it was called Koltso, or the Ring, and it was also held in Kiev, just a few blocks away from the first exhibition, and it was organized this time by Oleksandra Exter and Alexander Bohomazov, who met years before. They were both students of the Kyiv Art Academy, not Academy, sorry, but the Kyiv Art College, Училище, yeah. So, but they didn't graduate, both of them. Alexandra Exter went to study in Europe, to Paris and Milan, and Bohomazov continued his studies on. So this exhibition was already kind of more accepted because it was involving more of local artists, and it was a big, important exhibition at that time. So about the artist, yeah, I've already mentioned Davyd Burliuk, who is known as the father of the Russian avant-garde, strangely enough, because he was from Ukraine. This is one of his works named Ukrainians, and he considered himself being of the Cossacks' descent from south of Ukraine. But we are speaking about the Russian Empire time, yeah, so there is no kind of division for national countries within the Russian Empire, and the identity is more on the level of culture and language and some kind of visual, the references to the visual culture of previous decades. I've already also mentioned Alexander Bohomazov, who is one of the three main futurists in Europe, if I'm not wrong. Bohomazov was truly...
we can talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about that. So Bohomazov spent most of his life in Kiev, near Kiev, in a village where he had his home, and he painted a lot of the surrounding, and his wife and himself, or the auto-portraits, and this use of color and the futuristic topics, the themes, was truly extraordinary. But unfortunately, he was not known for decades because he hardly was published. He even created a theoretical work in 1914, which, if it would be published, would be maybe the first theoretical work on history of abstract art, but it was never published before 1991, and that's when it was first kind of brought to the world. Some more works of Alexander Bohmazov. These are different streets of Kiev and the first electricity man. Electricity is an issue now about Ukrainian culture and about Ukrainian art, and it was also in early 20th century. Oleksandra Exter is definitely the number one of artistic avant-garde in Ukraine. She was not only one of the first ones to go to Western Europe and bring the new tendency, the new artistic trends to Ukraine, where she had her own studio and then a school in Kiev and in Odessa. Sorry.
It'll pass in a second.
Yeah. And she was also a very brave, creative person to work with different media and different artistic approaches. This is why she was invited. To work with theater, where she produced a revolution. So the things that she introduced in theater decoration, in theater design, are studied in theater schools until these days, because she introduced many of the devices, the mechanical things, like the things were supposed to move, turn around. So she was a kind of an engineer for theater, or theater designer and engineer. Some of the costumes she produced, she also worked for film, and this is the costume for Aelita, one of the famous silent films. And it was her that started to work in the very new and a very unexpected medium. A friend of hers, another artist, Natalia Davydova, they also studied in this art college together, was a wealthy woman, and that at that time it was quite popular to create these art tiles, workshops for peasants in their mansions. And so Natalia Davydova opened a workshop with her peasant people in the village of Verbivka, which is not far from Cherkasy region. And these men and women and kids, they were sewing, but not only the traditional stuff. They did the traditional stuff as well, but also working with the avant-garde designs that were produced by artists from all over, back then Russian Empire, all over the country, and creating things like scarves, like purses, pillows, with these very strange abstract things. And it was even before the first exhibition of non-objective art, before the famous 010 exhibition in St. Petersburg, which introduced the objectiveless art for the first time. So we can absolutely for sure say that the first time that non-objective art was presented was in Verbivka, in Cherkasy region, and the first people who actually saw it were the peasant women and men in this village. This is Natalia Davydova, and these are unfortunately very poor images. I'm sorry for that, but this is all we had. Unfortunately, we really know very little about Natalia and her work, though she was exhibiting and she was working equally with her peers, with Alexandra Exter and others. And unfortunately, she had a very tragic destiny after 1917, after the revolution. Her mansion was burnt, and she had to escape, and she escaped to Odessa, and most of her collection and her artworks was destroyed on the way or when she was arrested, and she spent half a year in prison. Then she was able to immigrate, and she spent the rest of her life in France, the same as Oleksandra Exter. But unfortunately, we do know very little about her work until now. But we have these few images of the exhibition that they were able to do. There were actually several exhibitions of this art tile workshop. And for example, on this photograph down here, you can see a pillow with the design, which was made by Kazimir Malevich. And There are some artworks also by his students, and there are also artworks by designs here. Also, you can see in the middle a few works by Kazimir Malevich. So this was the first basic exhibition of non-objective art. And this is one of the designs, and this is the purse that the design was done by Oleksandra Exter. The purse does exist. It survived in the private collection, unlike many other objects that were lost. And of course, we cannot speak about avant-garde in Ukraine without mentioning Oleksandr Arhipenko, who grew up in Kiev. His father was a teacher, professor of the National University, and he grew up among the collection of the National University. It had its own collection, and there were these stone figures from back centuries ago, which we call pagan babas, the stone babas. And he was inspired by these strange figures, forms, and later on when he became a sculptor, and he worked also with the notion of emptiness. These was a combination that inspired him, and he started working with his cubism. He was the first person to work with cubism in sculpture, and not only became a famous sculptor, but also an inventor. And he invented many things you meet in your everyday life, but you don't know that it was invented by him. Like, for example, this commercial advertisement that changed, 3 times. They have 3 images different on 3 different sizes. That was also invented by him. And so we already spoke about 4 artists, and they were all mostly from Kyiv. Yeah, and finally we're in Kharkiv. Vasyl Yermylov was the constructivist artist, so he worked most of his life in Kharkiv, and he was working with a lot of practical things. Yeah, constructivists, they thought that art has to be here, used for very kind of necessary things, and so he worked a lot as a designer. He produced publication design, covers for books. He produced posters. He produced design for cigarettes, for candies. He decorated a train. So many kind of very useful, practical things. And also Kharkiv, which was the capital of Soviet Ukraine in the early 20s, was the capital of was the city where the most important magazine of the avant-garde time was released and was created. It was Nova Generacija, New Generation. The editor of this magazine was Mikhail Semenko, one of the most famous futurist writers and poets. And that was not just a literary magazine, it was covering all types of art, and many of the artists, visual artists, architects, designers, published their articles there as well. They had reviews of international exhibitions, of international publications. And the last cycle of articles by Kazimir Malevich in his lifetime was published also in Nova Generacija. It was a cycle of 12 articles that was actually supposed to be his last book, which he was going to publish in Ukraine, but unfortunately it never happened. So Vasyl Semenko, that's a mistake. That's a mistake, sorry. Yeah, I was writing about his brother also. Vasyl Semenko was his brother, who was an artist. And of course, that's Mikhail Semenko, I'm sorry. So Mikhail Semenko also produced this supra-poesia, he called it, supra-poesy, I don't know how to translate
poetic,
it.
Supra,
and
poetry.
Or it was called also poezo-malarstvo, which is like poetic painting. So these were poetic poetry created in this kind of visual, arranged in this visual manner. He had very many of them. And guess what? He was inspired by Kazimir Malevich when he created those things. So when they got to work together, actually in the late 20s, because these things were early 1910s, and then when they got to work together in 1920s, Semenko was really happy to work with someone that inspired him a decade ago. And actually Kazimir Malevich, who was born in Kiev, raised in Ukraine, then moved to Kursk, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and spent decades there. returned to Ukraine and to Kiev in the late 1920s as he was invited to work at the Kyiv Art Institute. He worked there as an invited professor for several years, introducing new approaches in art education, giving some classes to students to cure them from realism, and also his theory of education was kind of very medical. He was treating his students for curing them from realism. And he was also intending to move to Kiev from 1930, but it never happened because he was arrested in Leningrad at that time. And while he was arrested, he was fired from the Kyiv Art Institute. And this whole freedom, which allowed avant-garde and new art, which was called the New Cultural Renaissance, to emerge in the 20s, was collapsing because these all reforms were cancelled, and more censorship came, and people got arrested, people got killed. They were forced to forget their ideas, to kind of betray their own beliefs and principles, and just become all social realists, because that was the only method allowed in the Soviet Union. If we speak about avant-garde in Ukraine, we have to think it's really wide. You know, it was through all the genres. So cinema was also very important, and there was a lot of collaboration between writers and visual artists in cinema. So this is the time when Dzyga Vertov comes to Ukraine, and he's not longer able to work in Moscow or St. Petersburg or Leningrad. And this is where he creates his three most famous films: The Man with the Cameraman, the 11th, and the Symphony of Donbass, Enthusiasm, which are masterpieces, in world of masterpieces. And this is where Oleksandra Exter works at the same time. So that's also a kind of the development of these avant-garde ideas in cinema. And of course, theater. Theater was very important, and Les Kurbas was also part of this community. And also, it's worth mentioning that there was literally a community living together in Kharkiv at this time, in the 20s, in the building that was created for the writers on their initiative, designed by them. It was called the House Slovo, the House Word, and was in the shape of letter C, which is the capital for Slovo in Ukrainian. And Les Kurbas also lived there with basically all his team, the playwright and the artist he worked with, and many of the actors. So Les Kurbas created the Berezil Theater, which worked for more than a decade and was one of the most interesting theatrical phenomena of the time. And unfortunately, himself and many of his peers and friends were also executed in the 30s. Of course, you know, in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, it's impossible to give you a big explanation or a bigger picture of what avant-garde is, but definitely I'm encouraging you to find out more, because there are a lot of research done. There is a series of beautiful publications from Rodovit or other publishing houses, or other places. There are ways to find out more about avant-garde in Ukraine, and to know much more than just 10 names, or 2 names or 5 names, whatever. And this is just part of it. That's definitely not everything. So this is something I was. So this is just something like from the last few years, and there are publications that were created before the 90s, mostly abroad. And for example, one of the things we definitely are going to speak about is Oleg Ilnitsky and his famous research, because he was the first scholar who introduced the notion of avant-garde to the Western audiences and academics. And this was him who first actually put the question whether the phenomena should be called actually Russian avant-garde at all, because all of this was referred to as Russian avant-garde at some point, and it's only now that we are kind of defining parts of it as different avant-gardes or avant-gardes in different places and different countries. So thank you so much. I hope we have now an idea of what we're speaking about. So somewhere from 1908 to early 30s. So it's all over what is now Ukraine. I didn't speak much about the Western Ukraine because there was a little bit different story. The Polish, a lot of Polish and Jewish connections and Austro-Hungarian, but it was all in this international trend of the modern art, modernist art, and there were a lot of interesting and fascinating things happening. So,
Tanya, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction.